as they arrive. So hi everyone, welcome to the webinar Preventing Extinctions and Restoring Life to the Upper Murrumbidgee. Thanks so much again for joining us today. My name's Emily. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Officer here at the Conservation Council of the ACT region. I'd just like to start on behalf of the Conservation Council by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands and waters through which the Murrumbidgee River and its connected river systems flow, the Ngunnawal, Ngambri, Ngaigo and Walgaloo peoples, and all other First Nations communities with a connection to the river and the ACT region. We acknowledge the deep and continuing connection that First Nations people have with Murrumbidgee and their continuing role in caring for the river. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that we benefit from stolen country. So for those joining one of our webinars for the first time, the Conservation Council, we're the peak body for environment and climate groups in the ACT region. We're a not-for-profit, non-government organisation representing more than 50 member groups. And we're also a member of the Murray-Darling Conservation Alliance, which is an alliance of conservation councils throughout the Murray-Darling Basin, providing a national voice for Australia's largest river system. I can see that there are a number of representatives from our member groups who are here today, many of which are doing really great work to protect and restore the river, such as the Upper Murrumbidgee Catchment Network, Landcare ACT, and then the 3 catchment groups, the Ginninderra, Molonglo and Southern ACT catchment groups. So thanks very much for joining us today. I'd also like to shout out the amazing work that the Australian River Restoration Centre, Shawan, Jimmy, Pat and the team are doing through their Forgotten River campaign, which many of you would be familiar with. So thanks so much for your support and all that you do to make sure that Upper Murrumbidgee isn't left behind in water management. So many of us are here today because we care very deeply about or have a strong connection with the beautiful Upper Murrumbidgee River, which starts just above Tantangara Dam and flows all the way through New South Wales and the ACT to the Burrinjuck Reservoir. You might also be aware of some of the very serious challenges facing the river, which Anna and Antia will be speaking to, with the river receiving less than 10% of its natural flows, with fish species on the brink of extinction and frequent blue-green algal blooms. Well, the good news is that right now we have a really real and urgent opportunity to make our voices heard on the future of the river. So right now the community is being invited to provide feedback on a draft report by the independent review panel who recently reviewed the Snowy Water Inquiry Outcomes Implementation Deed, often called the SWIOD, which is essentially a review which looked at ways to improve the health of the Upper Murrumbidgee and the Snowy Rivers. And the panel's own draft report warns that without change, this river faces a gradual death. And so the independent review panel's report is 175 pages, which is a lot to take in. So I guess that's why we're here today. We want to help you understand some of the issues that the river's facing, what the panel's recommending, and how you can make your feedback count before the window for feedback closes. And to do that, we're joined by 2 incredible advocates who have a long-standing connection with the river and have participated in the review process as part of the stakeholder advisory group. So Antia Brademann and Anna McGuire, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. So Antia has been in the role of the Upper Murrumbidgee Demonstration Reach Facilitator for the last 10 years. And so the Upper Murrumbidgee Demonstration Reach is a cross-border conservation partnership that seeks to improve the health of the Upper Murrumbidgee River for the benefit of native fish and community wellbeing. And Anna is a very experienced water policy and river management researcher. She's worked on water policy in the ACT and across the Murray-Darling Basin and has published research on environmental releases in the Upper Murrumbidgee River. So welcome Anna and Antia, we're very happy to have you. Just some housekeeping for the webinar today. Each of our speakers will present for around 15 minutes, which will be followed by a Q&A session. So please put your questions into the chat as they come to mind. And then I'll facilitate the Q&A session. After the Q&A, we'll then walk you through how to have your say. So there's a short multiple choice survey open until the 4th of August that you can complete. And we'll share the link along with some suggested points to get you started. So with that all being said, I'll hand over to you, Antia.
Thank you kindly, Emily, and thank you to the ACT Conservation Council for providing this webinar today. I'd like to start with acknowledging that I'm joining you from beautiful Ngarigo country today in Cooma. It's a privilege to live here, and our town receives its drinking water from the Upper Murrumbidgee, just 8 kilometres out of town. So I'll start with sharing my slides, if you just bear with me. Is that appearing up on screen, Emily?
Yep, good,
perfect. So I thought that I might start with some background. This is a map, just to orient ourselves. This is a map that appears in the IRP report, and I just wanted to highlight where we are. So we're looking at the Upper Murrumbidgee River, and its headwaters are down here. And then the Upper Murrumbidgee flows down through New South Wales, through ACT, and then onwards down into the lower Murray-Darling Basin. We've also got the Snowy River, which flows down here, down to the sea and Marlow. And here on this map, we're representing the Snowy Scheme. So the Snowy Scheme was built in mid-19th century to capture and store water in the Snowy Mountains for irrigation and the Western districts. So this was incredibly efficient, and it basically took all of the water from all the rivers in this area, including the Snowy River, and put it into a series of storages to divert it out west. The hydroelectric generation allowed for cost recovery of the scheme. And you'll see that here, the headwaters of the Upper Murrumbidgee are captured here via Tantangra Dam, and then via a series of tunnels in the Snowy Scheme, water can be shifted down, and the water can then be released out into the Murray-Darling Basin, out to the west this way, via Tumut into the Murrumbidgee and into the Murray River. We also have Snowy 2 on this map, which is a bit of a game changer, whereas traditionally water sort of flowed downhill and through the turbines. You can see the water can flow down here, and then it can be recirculated back up into Tantangra Dam. Back when the Snowy Scheme was built, the common conception of how water should be managed is that the only water that should be let out of a dam was what was required for the water users. So all of the water was mainly going this way, and the only bit of water that was released out via Tantangra Dam and out into the Snowy River was what was required by the existing licenses at the time, which was not very much. The Snowy Water Inquiry in the early 2000s established that a rebalance was needed between energy, water diversion and the environment. We saw decline in the health of the rivers that were impacted and that didn't receive much water. And the Snowy Water Inquiry operations implementation deed, or the SWIOD, was established at the time as a mechanism to try and rebalance and find the better outcomes. At the time that it was penned, the SWIOD was a landmark environmental flow agreement. But the thing is that it hasn't been reviewed or updated for nearly 20 years. So today we find ourselves in a situation where it's no longer in line with current expectations for how we best manage our rivers. And there's also recognition now that the original outcomes intended by the deed are not being achieved in full. The abysmal state of the Upper Murrumbidgee is highlighting the need for change. Under the current arrangement, the Upper Murrumbidgee only receives between 2 and 10% of its natural flow. This is grossly insufficient to deliver the flows that a river needs to sustain its health. And there are other factors, such as the management arrangements being restrictive, with the flows for the Upper Murrumbidgee having to be set a year in advance. So they can't actually be synced with natural cues, and the infrastructure that is at Tantangra Dam is insufficient to deliver the appropriate flow regime. So in looking at this problem, let's consider, what does a river need to thrive? Well, it's no surprise if I tell you that the ecological processes in a river are primarily supported by flows. Flows, both their volume and duration, change with the seasons and are linked to different ecological functions. We have base flows, for example, which circulate oxygen and prevent stagnation, to large channel maintenance flows that scour our deep refuge holes and clean fine sediment and algal buildup from the bed. There are also really specific flows that we need in the Upper Murrumbidgee, flows that are linked to thermal cues which trigger events such as native fish spawning and support macroinvertebrate productivity. So the types of flows that a river needs are called ecological watering requirements, or EWRs. These describe the various flows and their function that a river needs. And the really good thing is that as part of this reviews, the EWRs that the Upper Murrumbidgee needs have been described, and they can actually be viewed in the Ecology Technical Report, which is on the review website. But in the broadest terms, an adequate flow regime allows the ecological processes to be self-sustaining, and typically needs all EWRs to be represented in a flow regime so that the health of the river can be self-sustaining. The hydrological modelling under the SWIOD review found that the volume required to support this in the Upper Murrumbidgee is a minimum of 30% of inflows. So when you compare that to the 10% that we're currently getting, we can see why the river is in trouble. The other thing to highlight is that thresholds apply. So channel maintenance will not occur when a lower volume is delivered, especially when we're recovering severely degraded systems such as the Upper Murrumbidgee. We actually need to hit specific thresholds to kickstart self-sustaining ecological processes. A little bit extra just won't achieve these outcomes. So it's like when we're sick and we go to the doctor and then we only take half of the prescribed medication and then we expect to get well from that. It just won't work. The good news is if we restore flows, recovery, while it is a long-term process that does take years, can be amazingly quick to start manifesting. So here I just want to acknowledge as well that the ecological health of a river is impacted by other factors, for example, catchment-based threats, and these also, of course, have to be addressed. But I think the big point that we have to remember here is that you cannot substitute measures that address threats if you haven't achieved the minimum level of self-sustaining functioning that flows provide. The last thing that I'd like to point out, what a river needs is a river is not independent of the landscape and its people, and we need a collaborative approach to support the health of our river. So I think when we look at the current state of the river, this is highly instructive to telling us what is the right balance going forward. And I think the thing to point out here with the SWIOID review is that the Upper Murrumbidgee River is so degraded that, as Emily mentioned, the IRP report clearly states that without immediate action, the river will likely die. The river is so degraded that we've already lost many aquatic species, and those remaining, such as Macquarie perch and Murray cod, are in steady decline. The river is so clogged up that we've lost most of our deep refuges, which are now filled up with sand. Our communities have the lived experience that the river is increasingly not safe for swimming, can't provide for the well-being and security of our communities or water supply. And while I don't have the authority to speak for First Nations, the First Nations Advisory Group report highlights how cultural values are also at risk. So what we're basically looking at for the Upper Murrumbidgee River is 60 years of degradation. There's already an extinction debt, and on top of that, we're likely facing increasing pressure with climate change and further regional development only likely to increase water demand. And this is not a safe situation. Moving forward, because the Upper Murrumbidgee, it's the third water supply for Canberra, our nation's capital. So this is where, we really applaud that the IRP highlights that we need systemic change. It needs to be a step change and not incremental improvements. Restoring the health of the river doesn't recur in isolation, and this complexity speaks to the package of reforms that the IRP has recommended. The other factors are issues such as uncoordinated governments, lack of community and First Nations involvement, lack of ecological objectives and monitoring, a lack of transparency and accountability. And all of these issues have been raised by our community and add to the dysfunction that isn't helping us support a healthy river. So while not all of these issues can be addressed by the SWIOID alone, due to the fact that some issues come under the responsibility of other agencies and instruments, we applaud the fact that the SWIOID review was sufficiently broad to examine these issues in full. And accordingly, I highlight that here the IRP is very clear that the recommendations are designed to be implemented together. So before I hand to Anna, I thought it might just be useful to provide a quick overview of the SWIOID review. And I want to highlight here that one of the really great things is that the review has been very comprehensive, and it now provides the detail that we need to move forward on this issue. The review has involved in-depth technical assessments and modelling, including ecological assessment, hydrological and energy modelling. Stakeholder and First Nations input has allowed for the lived experience and the community's needs and aspirations to be heard, as well as having a comprehensive assessment of all of the interests associated with the river. And the review has included a cost-benefit analysis to assess trade-offs between these interests. All the review documents and reports are published on the DQ website. And this is really great. And we do hope that such transparency continues. And I think as a community, it is essential that we request that this does continue as we move from recommendation to implementation. Again, I can't say highly enough that the independent review panel should be applauded for their comprehensive oversight of the issues and balancing the interests with strong recommendations that find that there is a clear way forward for our river. It finds that the health of the river can be fully restored with minimal impacts on downstream water users and the national electricity market, and only a small and reasonable reduction in electricity generation. And the cost-benefit analysis shows that the benefits far outweigh the costs when considering all of the interests. So now I'd like to hand over to Anna, who will tell you about the recommendations.
Thanks, Antia. And hi, everyone. It's nice to see so many people here today. I'll just share my screen, so bear with me. And as I do this, I'll acknowledge again the traditional owners of the catchments that we're talking about here across the Upper Murrumbidgee, and acknowledge their deep and ongoing connection to land and water, and that we have a lot that we can learn in terms of how we can respectfully manage a river. And also acknowledge the great work that the First Nations Advisory Group has done throughout this process. There have some really excellent work and really useful recommendations that have come forward. I assume you can see my screen. Yes, great. So yeah, Antia covered off on some of this, but basically, just to reiterate again, we're in a much better position now than we have been for a long time on the Upper Murrumbidgee already, simply because we have a whole lot of information that until now has been really, well, not available or really difficult to access. And that's around the state of the river, what kind of flows the river needs, and all of the information that Antia has just said. And the independent review panel has done a great job of doing this really rigorous analysis and also now publishing it all. So it is a lot of information to get through, but it's all there on the website. And it's, yeah, just a huge step forward that we now have this level of accountability. So yeah, I'm going to run through just some of the key findings and then some of the recommendations in a little bit of detail, and then just we'll talk through some of the areas that we think still maybe need a little bit of attention as well, and so highlighting some of the key issues that we'll be raising through that survey in the consultation. So as Antia mentioned, the independent review panel's report is upfront about the fact that we need urgent action for the Upper Murrumbidgee. The river system is in a bad state, and to quote the report, will likely die with flora and fauna irreversibly lost if we don't take action. And so this, again, is a really important step in this process, is to acknowledge the reality of the situation here for this river. One of the other key findings is that the river does need at minimum 30% of its annual natural flows. So when we talk about that, this is what would have been flowing down the river if the dam wasn't there. So the natural inflows of this catchment, and at the moment, at around 90% and more are being taken for the Snowy Hydro scheme. So this is the realisation that we need to allow the river to have at least 30% of the natural flows. Antia mentioned as well that one of the other findings was that the impacts on the national electricity market as a result of that change of releasing, say, 30% of flows would be minimal. Not to be downplayed, this is a complex system and we do need to understand how the Snowy Hydro scheme interacts with the national electricity market, and that work has been done and is really comprehensive. And so it's really reassuring to see that the conclusion is that there would be no significant impact on energy reliability or energy costs from such releases. And then another point which is really critical, and this was a big point during the stakeholder advisory group's work as well, was understanding what the impacts would be, if any, on downstream water users. And this is particularly for water users downstream of the Burrinjuck Dam. And so because the water that would be released, this additional water that would be released, will only be protected under under the current recommended approach as far as Burrinjuck Dam. So it's not proposed to be protected as environmental flows all the way down the system. And so the conclusion here was that the impacts on downstream irrigators would be minimal because the evaporation and transmission losses of putting that water down the river are actually really low according to the analysis that was done. Key point being, even though they are minimal, there's still an impact for entitlement holders. And so we also need to think about how that minor impact will be offset as well. And so the IRP has looked at that and made suggestions around that as well. So there are 24 recommendations, and I won't try and run through all of them, but I'll just summarize some of them and some of the bigger ones. So the first recommendation is obviously that recommendation to release 30% of flows, which is 87 gigalitres per year. The panel are also proposing a staged delivery. So with the first 5 years, the river getting 23% of flows, and then subject to a review after those 5 years, increasing to 30% of flows. I will highlight sort of our points on these at the end, but just quickly to say that we don't think there is a need to wait 5 years to release 30% of flows. We know that's what the river needs. And so this is also linked to the need to upgrade the Tintangara Dam outlet to enable those larger flows, which at the moment is a major constraint on being able to deliver the flows that are needed to scour the sediment from the riverbed. But we think that even without that dam outlet upgrade, 30% of flows can be released and would be highly beneficial for the river. So we think that's a good starting place. The second recommendation is to, within 2 years, complete an independent cost estimate or feasibility study for that Tintangara Dam outlet upgrade. This is really important, and we really welcome a firm timeframe on that. We think 2 years is realistic, and we also highlight that that cost estimate needs to be independent or independently verified so that we can know that it is reliable. The further recommendations are to establish a monitoring program. And again, this is really important because to date, there hasn't been a kind of systematic monitoring of river health and also of how the river responds to flows and how species respond to flows. So the proposal is for the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder to sort of oversee that monitoring program, and this would be highly beneficial for understanding the river and for knowing how best to deliver flows as well. It's also a recommendation for, as I mentioned, impacts on water users downstream to be offset, and the proposed mechanism is for the ACT government to provide water entitlements to the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder. It's a little confusing, but the main point here is that impacts on downstream water users should be offset. And then also some points here around, because this review was quite targeted and focused on the Upper Murrumbidgee, but there are a number of rivers that are sort of managed under this same scheme, and that includes the Snowy River and some other montane rivers as well. And so this draft report is also recommending further work to better understand the Snowy River and delivering on the target that the existing target for the Snowy River and what that would mean. And again, same with recommendation 6. So further work is needed to understand the Snowy and other montane rivers and fully support that. I think that's really important work. We can't just think about the health of the Upper Murrumbidgee River. These other rivers also need attention and need work to improve health. One of the other recommendations in the report is to decommission the Moamba Weir, which would be highly beneficial for restoring natural flow regimes in this river. It has been proposed at various times over the years, and it's really great to see that this recommendation has made it in. This would be really, really important for all sorts of species, native fish, yeah, just river health generally. There's also a recommendation to provide more flexibility in flow delivery. And again, really important aspect of this work, because at the moment, under the current arrangements, there's really not a lot of flexibility. Flow releases are determined or set a year in advance, which means that river managers don't have the ability to respond to natural events. For example, if there's a rainfall event, a water manager might want to make a release to piggyback on that in a way to get a higher flow event than they might be able to get by just releasing volume at other times. And under current arrangements, that's not possible. So this would be really beneficial. There's also some recommendations around transparency and a transparent decision-making framework. Really welcome that recommendation. It's, yeah, as Antia mentioned, it's for the long-term health of the river. It's really important that community and stakeholders can understand how management is working and have a say in how that's happening as well. So transparency and public reporting and monitoring will be very important. And then a recommendation to establish a new deed. I think anyone who's looked at the current deed will understand why this is really necessary. It's a very old document and it needs to be upgraded. It needs measurable performance indicators, and they've also suggested 5-yearly audits and 10-yearly reviews, which will be really valuable for assessing progress as we go and making sure that we don't end up with a similar situations to what we have now, where the deed might, sit in place for 20 years without actually being reviewed. And yeah, recommendation to strengthen participation. The SOE Advisory Committee already includes community representation, but there's a proposal to sort of expand it to include the ACT, to better include First Nations, and to expand community representation. I won't run through all of these because I feel like we've covered some of them, but yeah, there's also recommendation to establish the monitoring reporting framework and to strengthen compliance and enforcement. And I'll just highlight here that compliance and enforcement will be very important, as well as designing the scheme so that we know that enough water will be available every year to meet the targets, but also that whatever we call them, whether it's a target or a requirement, there's an understanding that this volume of water is the minimum that needs to be released for the environment, and there is compliance and there are consequences if that volume is not delivered. So our experience to date demonstrates why this is so incredibly important for the scheme. Under the current arrangements, the targets are more of an aspiration and are not, the system is designed in a way that means in a lot of years there's not enough water available to actually meet the target. So very important point. And then recommendations 16 and 17 to work with First Nations to establish a First Nations custodial framework and improve water entitlements. Both of these just incredibly valuable pieces of work that need to happen. And again, yeah, acknowledge the excellent work that's been done by the First Nations Advisory Group that has provided advice on these issues to the review panel. Final set of recommendations here. So this is related to sort of broader catchment management, and so how it's recommended an acknowledgement that it's not just about releasing water, but we actually also need to do broader actions like riparian restoration, erosion control, and that work will be really, really vital for improving the health of the river. And that First Nations people along the river should have the opportunity to be involved and have custodianship in those catchment management activities. Just, yeah, a few other points here around some corporate governance and compensation recommendations. So there is a recommendation to implement an ongoing kind of financial contribution by Snowy Hydro to support environmental outcomes. And this is great, really valuable recommendation, and also in line with the National Water Initiative that governments have signed up to, which is about implementing a user pays kind of approach. So it's consistent with national policy direction. And then, yeah, a couple of other points are around revising corporate governance to better account for the environmental and social benefits that river health offers, real game changer. And also some suggestions around altering the compensation framework under the current arrangements, the need to compensate Snowy Hydro for any losses in water availability was a limiting factor. And so this is proposing, I guess, a clearer kind of rules-based approach to compensation, and that those review periods would offer a chance for changes that maybe could not involve compensation. All right, so I will speed along here. So at the moment, as Antia mentioned, there's a survey that's open until the 4th of August. It is a multiple choice kind of a survey, but you can also put in written responses for some of them as well. And so we have prepared some guidance that's available on the Conservation Council website to help people make it through this survey and understand some of these issues. Can be daunting to wade through the hundreds of pages of technical reports. And so we've tried to consolidate that. And the final IRP report will be handed to the federal department in August and to ministers in September. So it's a pretty short turnaround here. And finally, some of the key points that we have highlighted in our guidance are around the need for minimum 30% of flows to be returned. The fact that we don't think we need to wait 5 years to do that, that the 30% can be delivered immediately, even without the dam outlet upgrade, even though the upgrade would be the best option for environmental outcomes. Secondly, that there's no substitute for flows, that those flows should be delivered and not kind of using any sort of benefit equivalents to offsets programs that we've seen in the Murray-Darling Basin. We just clearly need that water in the river, and anything else should be in addition to that. We need to make sure the scheme's designed in a way that makes sure enough water is available to meet the target. It sounds very basic, but learning from past mistakes, this is important to resolve. And yeah, just strong support for the governance reforms that have been proposed, and for the First Nations custodial leadership and water rights, and yeah, those other reforms as well. So yeah, again, as Antia said, just really recognising the great work that's been done by the IRP, and yeah, hoping that we can get a great outcome for the river from here. So yeah, we just have in our slides as well some links to where you can find further information, and the survey itself, which is also available on our website. So I'll stop there, and hopefully we have lots of time for questions.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, we've got quite a few questions coming in through the chat. So yeah, just encourage everyone to keep putting them into the chat, and we'll hopefully get to them one by one. Thanks so much, Anna and Antia. It was an awesome presentation. I feel like I've learned so much, and going through the recommendations in detail is pretty good. I want to start with my own question, just because I know a lot of our audience is from the ACT, and they may not have realised that the ACT wasn't a party to the suite or to the deed that governs the management of this river. And I guess in that sense, the ACT really has lacked that decision-making power over the river. I noticed, yeah, recommendation 12 includes the recommendation to include the ACT as a party to the SWIO. I guess, what do you see the benefits of like the ACT now being potentially involved in decision-making?
Sorry, do you want me to start, Antia? Yeah, well, obviously this is just such an important issue for the ACT to be involved in. Yeah, the river runs right through the ACT, and is so important to so many people. So I think just, yeah, that ability to have oversight and involvement in community, involvement in First Nations, involvement in how the water is managed is just invaluable.
And so, further to that, I would add, since we've had the National Water Initiative, the reforms in the 2000s, those reforms were implemented because we recognised that, borders don't, they don't have borders. They flow across borders. Our environmental management, water management is state-based, but the National Water Reform recognised that we needed to manage on more collaborative across borders. We've had the Murray-Darling Basin Plan as an example. And I think the SWIWOD is no different to that. And this is a real opportunity to provide that mechanism for more collaboration. And as I would, just highlight from my talk, is that the ACT is relying on the Upper Murrumbidgee for its third water supply. So I think there's a great interest there and a great need to be able to be a party to the deed that potentially provides that, just as one example.
I totally agree. Thank you. I'm going to jump to a question from Graham. Graham's asked, do you think that decreasing the flow rate of the Upper River will be useful in decreasing sediment deposits west of Canberra? I guess that's referring to perhaps some of the sand slugs and things that have popped up around Flower area.
I'm happy to start with that one.
Yeah.
I was a little bit unsure whether there was the question was asking for increasing flows to move sediment on, but the sedimentation in the Upper Murrumbidgee is an issue that's really affecting the health of the river, the health of it to function within, warming climate. I've talked about the loss of our refuge pools due to sedimentation. And once sediment is in the river, it's going to move on no matter what the flow rate. If there's a flow rate, it'll create enough energy to scour deep refuges and move it on a bit faster. Or if it's slow, it'll just sort of dribble through. So yes, flow rates are really important in moving sediment. In terms of the Upper Murrumbidgee River, we now have the sediment in stream. And so the only way we can actually mobilise it and help the river to function is to actually create that through a flow regime. So yeah, unfortunately, the question said, should we decrease the flow to make sure sediment doesn't get downstream? Well, it will get downstream eventually. Yeah.
Thanks, Antia. I guess on the topic of flow regimes, I have a question from Gordon. Is the 30% minimum flow requirement an annual average? If so, how should the flows be varied across the year to match the seasons?
Do you want me to start, Anna, or? So yeah, the 30% is the 30% of the inflows. So in a dry year, we would get less. In a wet year, we would get more. And the way a river should be managed ecologically is responding to what's happening in that year ecologically. So that is a minimum 30%. I did note that there was another comment in the chat by Louise Crisp, and I thought maybe we can bring that in as well. And thank you for your comment, Louise. You say Water Management ACT New South Wales 2000 requires 56 to 80% of flow retained in a regulated river for it to be healthy, and so why is only 30% recommended for the Upper Murrumbidgee? So in answer to that question, Louise, that comes back to the hydrological modelling. So how that worked was all of the ecological water requirements were described that are needed for the functioning of the river, and then achieving those and the volumes and durations that are associated with those were modelled, and the 30% figure came up as the modelling as the amount you need to meet those ecological water requirements to address its health. So the point you raise is really important, because a river actually, to function really well and be self-sustaining, probably needs more than 30%, but the hydrological modelling you need a minimum of 30 to furnish those ecological watering requirements. And I really can't stress that enough, that 30% is not the outrageous kind of upper limit. 30% is the minimum that's needed, and that relates to the point that you raise.
Did you have anything else to add?
No, I think Antia nailed it.
Me too. I'll move on to a question from Russell. Russell's asked, what sort of ecological effects are expected from increased flows, and how soon might data be available to show those impacts to inform future decision making?
Anna, do you want me to go again? While recovery does take time and it's a trajectory, some results will be there really fast. So I described that flows have different ecological functioning. So for example, in the drought, we need those base flows because I think the technical data shows that if we have a flow rate below 80 megalitres per day at Lobbs Hole, the dissolved oxygen plummets. So, a flow regime that provides that high base flow will support circulation of dissolved oxygen and keeping our fish alive, basically. So those are some effects you could see straight away. Channel maintenance flows provide an essential reset. So when the bed gets clean, currently there's so much sediment and algae, it's called bed armoring. That can be removed within 1 or 2 flow events. And the point that you make about, how soon can we see the effects? Well, this really comes back to the monitoring that currently is lacking in great detail. Water New South Wales support the environmental flow regime and they do the best that they can, but we need ecological objectives to be described. We need to describe what are the types of things we want to see with flows, and then we need to put in a resource monitoring program to show us how we're going. And that's really important for this river going forward.
I might ask a question on the monitoring going forward. Will that sort of data be captured in the proposed 5-yearly reviews that the IRP report recommends?
It'd be a great thing to ask for, Emily. So put that into your Have Your Say survey.
I'll put that into my submission. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it would be great to have in there, but also to have annual reporting. I know that some of these trends take longer to observe than every year, but even just annual reporting on some of these elements would be great as well. And if I can just add one thing, because I also just read Louise's comment before about why so low, why is 30% enough? And I think this is a really useful point to think about because our bar is quite low with this river. It's in such a poor state of health that we're really happy to kind of improve it even to 30%. But over time, we might actually, it'd be great to see how the river recovers with 30% and then to look to the future as well, because, yeah, it is common practice for rivers to retain, more than 30% of their flow for health as well.
And on that, the ecology technical report is great. It's on the DQ website, and it quite clearly describes that, depending on what we're willing to give this river, there could be a range of outcomes. If we just do a little bit of incremental change, we might keep things as they are. So that comes back to the point that we're starting from that low base. Is that acceptable that we maintain a severely degraded river with declining threatened species as it is? It was not acceptable to me, right to, recovery of the river and being able to self-sustain its health and provide all those needs for our communities and our regional security into the future, in the light of climate change. So that's where, I'm in the Let's Go for River Recovery camp there.
On I guess, considering future climate change and future climate scenarios, how well do you feel that the IRP has accounted for future climate impacts in determining recommendation for a 30% flow rate?
Anna, do you want to take this?
It's a good question. It's definitely covered in there more than is in the current arrangement. So it's a good step forward. Yeah, I guess we'll have to wait and see what the detail is in terms of how climate change impacts are factored in. I suppose if the 30% of inflows to the dam over time, if inflows decrease with climate change, then we'll see decreased environmental releases as a result. And so it'd be interesting to see what mechanisms are put in place to deal with that, I suppose, to adjust over time and to respond to emerging issues if we do see, you know, new threats coming up with climate change. So I suppose to me that's kind of to be seen in the detail.
Yeah, makes sense. Just a question now from Philip. Philip's asked, is there any point considering whether installing a turbine at Tantangara Dam to capture electricity from the additional flows would be economic? I'm not sure if this is one for Snowy Hydro, but if either of you had any thoughts, that would be good.
Sorry, Andy, you go.
Well, there is, I think as we speak, they're installing a massive turbine and we finish in 2028, and it's called Snowy 2.0, as far as I see it. But yeah, I think just the point that is highlighted here for me is that we do need to have a conversation around the infrastructure on Tantangara Dam. It is currently not fit for purpose to deliver the type of flows that we need for whole of system recovery. And what I mean is by, you know, providing flows even downstream of the dam. So currently with the small amount of flow allocation that we have, water manager are in a situation where they have to, there's just not enough water to release water out of the dam 365 days a year. So the reach downstream of the dam doesn't receive any flows at all, you know, and that reach used to have two-spine blackfish. Apparently when Tantangara was established, there was a thriving population of Macquarie perch in there, showing that they had gotten up through the natural barriers there. So, so definitely that is an area, and it's an IRP recommendation that an assessment is made on what it would cost and how the outlet needs to, so the outlet basically needs to be enlarged. It can only provide a maximum of 2,000 megalitres a day. A channel maintenance flows is 6,000 megalitres a day. So to provide those benefits downstream of the dam, that's what's required. But I like the question, you know, let's have a look at these innovative solutions. Is it possible to put a hydro on the dam? That's you know, there's a hydro on Burrinjuck Dam. I'm not an engineer, but you know, we really need to think out of the box on this, and let's see if we can upgrade the dam. On that, that will be a cost. The Tantangara Dam was built in the 60s. It's old infrastructure. The outlet was designed to only let out a small bit of flow, but here I'd like to refer everyone back to the cost-benefit analysis. So the cost-benefit analysis in the review put a nominal figure of 300 million to upgrade that dam. So the recommendation is let's review what's actually needed and the cost. But even at 300 million, the cost-benefit analysis says that there is an overall benefit to all of the needs of the river by doing that, even with that investment. And an interesting moment that I had in the stakeholder advisory group when I talked to one of the people that were representing the irrigators, they said 300 million in the scheme of things in terms of large infrastructure projects and dams, it's kind of not a lot of money. So those are the points I'd like to highlight there. Over to you, Anna.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, just on the turbine question, I suppose there has been such a strong focus on energy, and in part what we're trying to shift to is valuing other aspects of the river health as well. But I think it's a great question. But my take would probably be that Snowy 2.0 is kind of maximizing the generation capacity from this dam, and that, you know, maybe that's good enough. But yeah, I'm not an engineer, so there you go.
Just got a comment, but I'm going to ask it as a question from Linto, which I'm pretty sure is Mark Linterman's, our fish expert. He said some interim lower cost and quicker options to release more flows from Tantangara should be explored, pumps or siphons, instead of upgrading the intake regulator. Was that something, I guess, that was considered as an option throughout the review process?
Yeah, it was definitely discussed in our advisory group, not in any great detail. I think the general sense was that it's not that viable, but we didn't kind of look into it in more detail. I think it's, you know, it's worth considering.
And indeed, you know, that's the recommendation in the review, that the feasibility around these and the options are assessed. From our perspective, the UMDR, we would like that to be an independent review, and also, you know, that we do think outside of the box on this and that we do consider all those different options.
Yeah. Just had a question. We've got time for a few more from Tristan. He said, thanks for a great presentation. Thank you both. Do you think that legislating the Murrumbidgee as a living entity would be a practical alternative or supplement to the intergovernmental deed? He says this would really help achieve some of the panel's recommendations.
Yeah, great point. Totally agree it would. And, you know, there are some good precedents with rivers in New Zealand being acknowledged as legal entities. Perhaps a longer term challenge. I wouldn't want to hold our breath on that one for the Upper Murrumbidgee. Might delay things a little, but yeah, I mean, it's a really live issue, as in how we can sort of enshrine the rights of rivers, and yeah, in the longer term, I suppose, really respect the needs and rights of rivers. And yes, Maxine makes a good point. It's also happening for other rivers, the Yarra, for example.
Thanks, Maxine. Got another question from Louise Christ. I'm not sure if we answered this earlier. Is the 30% inclusive of the Upper Murrumbidgee River portion of the Snowy Montane River's increased flows bucket? Which I'm not familiar with that, but I assume that's referring to other flows legislated.
Yeah, I think that yes, we're talking about a sort of new deed, or a new deed replacing the Upper Murrumbidgee's portion of the current bucket, I guess, that increased flows bucket, with a new target. So yeah, instead of the current target, we're suggesting a new target. I hope that answers the question.
All right, that's great. We're 5 minutes to time. I might ask one more question. I guess, Antia, you mentioned, yeah, you live in Cooma. The Murrumbidgee River is like Cooma's water supply. I guess I'd be keen to hear about, I guess, your lived experience and I guess of the Cooma community relying on this river for water. I guess, how important do you think the review and the panel's like report is, I guess, for the community?
Look, that's true. We rely on the Upper Murrumbidgee River, and interestingly, for our community in Cooma, you know, many people in Cooma work at Snowy Hydro. All of these issues interrelate, and I think that's what the review has highlighted. And in its broad consideration of all the interests, has tried to find a way forward there. So I think it's really encouraging. So obviously that, you know, for us in Cooma and our water supply, the health of the river is really vitally important, but also the fact that there is a way forward that can meet the balance between energy generation and protecting our precious environment. You know, if we can achieve that, I think there's a really good news story, and especially for a community like ours in Cooma, where, you know, the hydro power generation is a really important part of the makeup of our town. And I think, you know, a way forward looks at how we can generate energy, and we can also look after and meet the responsibility that we have towards keeping our environment healthy and ensuring that it can sustain our communities into the future.
Thank you. I think we'll have one more question from Louise and then we'll leave it at that. She's asked that the Snowy Montane River's annual volume and allocation proportional to Snowy below Jindabyne allocation goes to 2 sections of the Upper Snowy, the Gradgeby, the Geehigh and the Murrumbidgee. If the Murrumbidgee water was delivered by other processes, could that deliver more water to the Upper Snowy? Sorry, I hope that makes sense, Louise.
I think maybe this kind of goes to the recommendations in the report around future work looking at the Snowy and the other montane rivers, which might then need their targets revised as well. So I'm not sure if I've answered the question. yeah, I don't know. I think maybe we don't really know how this is all going to link together, and we'll have to just kind of see.
Yeah. All right. I think we're
on, if I could just add something there, is that, you know, linking it all together and making it work is the process that we're now finding, recommendation to implementation. And so, you know, these questions are really important, and we still have a bit of work to, you know, collaborate together and to see how we will implement these recommendations and what we will do. So I just want to highlight a comment that Max made, you know, that these IRP recommendations are a great start, and now the journey continues. And I can't highlight from the community perspective, you know, how important that is, that that continues to be transparent, that continues to hear the voices of our community, of governments that are not party of the deed, like the ACT, First Nations people, and that's co-designed together so that we can address all of these little issues and things that still need to be worked out.
Yeah, absolutely agree. It's just so important that people have input now at this point in the process, but also that we keep our eyes on this process to make sure that it does keep progressing and keep moving.
So please get on, have your say, support positive change.
Yeah, so yeah, as you heard, the survey's open till the 4th of August, Tuesday the 4th of August. That's, yeah, 2 weeks' time. I have put the link to the survey in the chat, but I'll be sending an email to everyone who attended the webinar or registered with a link to the survey, and then also to the Conservation Council's survey guide. So if you'd like to see, I guess, what we discussed in the webinar today on paper with suggested responses to each of the survey questions, that will be coming around in an hour or so. The webinar is also being recorded. That will be hopefully coming around as a link in our Conservation Council Yellow Box newsletter. I will also send a link to sign up to that. If not, it will be available on our YouTube page as soon as possible. We do rely on a volunteer to do the video editing, so I'll be encouraging them to do it as quickly as possible, so this resource is available. But yeah, thanks again everyone for coming. Really appreciate having you here, and yeah, thanks again to the Australian River Restoration Centre for their support. And yeah, have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you. Goodbye.